That morning, she made his tea the way she always had, 2 sugars, no milk, steeped exactly 4 minutes, and then she set the cup down on his desk, turned around, and never made it again. Not because she was angry. She had moved through anger a long time ago, the way you move through a room in the dark. She knew where all the furniture was. She had stopped bumping into things. Her name was Theodora Vane. Everyone called her Thea. She had been Mrs. Whitmore for 7 years, and in those 7 years she had learned to be very, very good at disappearing inside a life that looked, from the outside, like everything a woman of her position could want. The house on Alderton Square was beautiful. She had made it so. The dinners were impeccable. She had designed them. The accounts were balanced. The correspondence answered. The social calendar managed with the kind of invisible precision that made guests say what a natural hostess she was. What warmth. What grace. And then look past her to her husband, Lawrence Whitmore, who stood at the head of the table and accepted their admiration as if it had simply arrived there on its own. She had married him at 23. It had been a practical arrangement, the kind that was spoken of in those circles with a particular kind of dignity, as though practicality itself were something noble. Her father's business had failed the previous winter. Lawrence's family had standing but needed the connection hers could still provide. Her mother had sat across from her at the small table in their diminished parlor and said, very quietly, that Lawrence Whitmore was a good man, that a good man was enough. Thea had believed her. She was 23, and she had believed that goodness, in a man, would eventually turn into something warmer. It did not. Lawrence was not cruel. She had turned this thought over in her mind so many times in 7 years that it had worn smooth, like a stone from a riverbed. He was not cruel. He was simply absent. Present in every room he entered, heavy with authority and opinion, and the particular confidence of a man who had never been made to question himself, and yet somehow not quite there, not quite seeing her. She stood next to him at parties and he would look just past her shoulder. She sat across from him at breakfast and he would read the paper from first page to last without looking up. She told him, once, in the 2nd year, that she had been unwell for 3 days. He said, and turned a page. She told him again. He said he hoped she felt better soon, and asked if the Alderton account had been filed. She filed it. She told herself that this was the nature of marriage for women of her class, of her time, of her circumstance. She told herself that companionship was perhaps too much to ask for. She told herself that she had known what she was agreeing to, but she had not known about the loneliness. That was the thing no one told you. Not the loneliness of being alone. She had been alone before, and alone had its own kind of peace. This was the loneliness of being invisible to someone who ate across from you every morning, who slept in the adjacent room, who said good evening Theodora when he came in at night and meant nothing by it. Nothing at all, as if her name were simply a formality. She became, over the years, exceptionally competent. It was the only thing left to master. She managed the household accounts herself, because the previous secretary had made errors, and Lawrence didn't want to deal with it. She handled the correspondence with his business associates, drafting letters in his voice, so precisely that his partner Mr. Hale once told Lawrence, "Your replies have gotten rather eloquent lately," and Lawrence had said, "Yes, I've been making more of an effort," and Thea had been standing 2 feet away, refilling the water glasses. She organized his mother's birthday celebration. She sourced a builder for the renovation of the East Wing. She negotiated with the groundskeeper when he tried to overcharge for the spring planting. She learned enough about Lawrence's investment concerns that she could hold a 40-minute conversation with his solicitor. Without Lawrence present, and the solicitor always left looking satisfied, and Lawrence never thought to ask what had been discussed. He did not notice any of it. Not the noticing part. He noticed the results, the way you notice that a lamp is on, without thinking about who lit it. The house ran. The accounts balanced. The dinners went well. That was simply how things were. That was simply what Thea did. In the 5th year, she had tried one more time to say something. They were sitting in the drawing room after supper. Lawrence was reading. She had been sitting for 20 minutes with a book open on her lap that she had not looked at once, and she said, "Lawrence," and he said, without looking up, and she said, "I sometimes feel as though you don't quite see me," and there was a pause, and he turned a page, and he said, "What do you mean, Theodora? You're right there." She looked at him for a long moment. He was already reading again. She picked up her book. She did not say anything else. Not that night. Not in the years that followed. There was no incident, no explosion, no dramatic confrontation. There was simply a woman who had done the math, quietly, and arrived at a number she didn't know what to do with yet. She started keeping a record, not a diary. She was too careful for that. Just a small notebook she kept in the drawer of her writing desk, in which she noted, in plain shorthand, the things she was responsible for. The accounts she managed. The letters she drafted. The arrangements she made. She did not do this out of bitterness. She did it because she had begun to understand that she needed to see it clearly herself, before she could understand what it meant. What it meant was this. Lawrence Whitmore did not have a competent household. He had a wife who was doing the work of 3 people while being treated as a pleasant piece of furniture, and he had no idea, and she had allowed it. And that was also something she needed to see clearly. She began, in the 6th year, to make other arrangements. Not to leave, she was not ready for that yet, or perhaps she was being precise about the timing, which amounted to the same thing. She began to put money aside. Not large sums, she was careful. The household accounts had a margin she had built in over the years. Small discrepancies no one would notice. Small surpluses redirected with perfect quietness into an account she had opened under her maiden name at a bank across the city. She had done this methodically, the same way she did everything, with the attention to detail that no one had ever appreciated in her, and that she had decided, finally, to appreciate in herself. She began to take on private work, quietly. A widow in Kensington, who needed someone to manage her correspondence and her finances, introduced through a mutual friend who knew Thea's competence without quite knowing how she'd acquired it. Then a second client. Then a third. She met with them on Thursday mornings, which Lawrence believed she spent at her cousin's. She had no cousin in the city. She had never explained this. He had never asked. She was 29 years old and she was building something, brick by quiet brick, in the spaces where no one was looking. The dinner, when it finally happened, was on a Thursday in November. They were hosting a table of 12. Lawrence's colleagues, 2 members of Parliament, a judge and his wife, a man named Mr. Forsyth, who was something in banking and had been trying to get Lawrence's attention for months. It was the kind of dinner Thea had organized 100 times, the kind where the flowers had to be just so, and the wine had to be chosen in advance, and the seating arrangement was a kind of diplomacy, and she had managed it as she always did, entirely and invisibly. The first 2 courses went well. Lawrence was charming in the way he could be when an audience suited him. Thea sat at the opposite end of the table and directed the rhythm of conversation with the small precise movements she had perfected. A question here, a redirect there, and the room flowed, and everyone was at ease. And she watched it all with the mild detachment of someone who had learned to be good at something they no longer particularly cared about. The trouble began in the 3rd course, during a lull. One of the wives, a Mrs. Randolph, with kind eyes and the habit of including everyone, leaned across the table and said to Lawrence, "Your wife tells me she studied botany at one point. How lovely that she kept that up." There was nothing particularly dangerous in this. Thea had mentioned it briefly, early in the evening, a small detail offered to fill a silence. Lawrence turned toward her. He had the expression of a man consulting an interior file cabinet. He said, "Ah, yes, Thea was always," and then he paused, and something shifted in his face, a brief blankness, almost mechanical, and he said, with perfect ease, "Rosalind was always the one with the garden. Thea does quite well with numbers, though." The table moved on. Someone made a comment about greenhouse windows. Someone else laughed. Thea sat very still. "Rosalind." She set down her fork, not loudly, not with drama. She set it down the way you set down something you are finished with, and she looked at Lawrence, and he was already talking to Mr. Forsyth, already turned away, and she looked at him for a long quiet moment, and she felt something settle in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite anger. Rosalind was his first wife. She had died 4 years before his marriage to Thea. Thea had known this. Everyone knew this. There were no photographs of Rosalind in the house because Thea had, in the first year, quietly suggested that some of them might be retired to storage, and Lawrence had agreed without apparent feeling either way. She was not jealous of a dead woman. She was not, she realized, feeling any of the things she might have expected to feel. What she felt, sitting there with her hands folded in her lap and the conversation flowing around her like water around a stone, was something closer to clarity. He had looked at her, his wife, the woman who had managed every facet of his life for 7 years, and called her by the name of the woman before her, without embarrassment, without catching himself, without, it was clear, any particular awareness that he had done it at all. Mrs. Randolph was looking at her, just briefly, a flicker of something, sympathy or recognition, and then she looked away. The dinner continued. Thea smiled at the right moments. She redirected a conversation that was threatening to become political. She signaled to the housekeeper at exactly the right time for the dessert course. She was, as always, excellent. She went to bed that night and lay on her back in the dark and looked at the ceiling and felt, for the first time in a very long time, completely calm. She had already been going. She understood, in that darkness, that she had been going for 2 years. She had simply been waiting. With the same methodical patience she applied to everything, for the moment when she knew with certainty that she was right to leave. That this was not something that could be fixed with more time, more effort, more precision. That there was no version of staying that ended with her being seen. She had found it. In the morning, she dressed and came downstairs and sat across from Lawrence at breakfast, and he said good morning and picked up the paper. And she drank her tea and watched him read, and she thought about the notebook in the drawer upstairs. All those pages of shorthand. And she thought about the account across the city, and she thought about Mrs. Calloway in Kensington, who had told her 2 weeks ago that she was the most capable person she had ever employed. And she thought, enough. She waited until Lawrence left for his meeting. Then she went upstairs to the room she used as a study. Not the desk in the bedroom, which was his domain, but the small room at the end of the hall that she had arranged for herself in the 2nd year, which Lawrence sometimes forgot was hers. And she packed a bag with the things that mattered. She was very careful about which things those were. Not the jewelry, most of it had been his family's, and she had no use for it. The letters from her mother, the notebook, the small watercolor of the Dorset coast she'd bought herself 3 years ago from a street market for 2 shillings, and which Lawrence had never commented on, her books, the papers she needed. She did not pack hastily. She had known what she would take for months. She left a letter on the desk in the study, the main one, the one where Lawrence signed things. She had written it carefully, over many drafts, and the final version was 3 pages. She told him the truth. Not as accusation, not as complaint, but as information. She told him what she had done for 7 years, listed plainly. She told him about the accounts and the correspondence, and the arrangements he had never asked about. She told him that she did not believe he was a bad man, and she meant it. And she told him that she believed he had simply never thought very hard about whether she was a person. She told him she was going, and where she could be reached through a solicitor, if there were legal matters to address. And she signed it Theodora Vane, her maiden name, because that was who she was going back to, and that felt important to say in writing. She walked out of the house on Alderton Square at 10:30 in the morning, with a single bag. And the sun was out, and the street was ordinary, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like herself. Lawrence read the letter at noon, when he returned from his meeting. He read it standing up, which is how she had imagined he might, and then he sat down, heavily, in the chair behind the desk, and read it again. He was not, if he was being honest with himself, and being honest with himself was not something he had practiced much, entirely surprised, not by the leaving. He hadn't imagined the leaving, exactly. But there was something in the letter, in the specific and measured accounting of it, that landed with the weight of something he had known was there, and had simply not permitted himself to look at directly. She had signed it with her maiden name. He sat with the letter for a long time. Then he called for Patterson, the housekeeper, to ask about lunch, and Patterson said she wasn't sure what was in the larder, because Mrs. Whitmore had usually managed that, and Lawrence said surely someone knows, and there was a pause, and he understood, very slowly, what a pause in that context meant. He sent a message to his solicitor. He sent a message to Mr. Hale, his business partner, asking about 3 matters that he now realized he had, for some time, simply assumed were being handled. He opened the filing drawer in the study, looking for a particular set of correspondence, and found that everything was organized in a system he did not entirely understand, labeled in Thea's handwriting, and that he could not immediately locate what he was looking for. He sat back. He thought about the dinner. He thought about Mrs. Randolph's face. He thought about the way Thea had set down her fork. He had seen it, at the edge of his attention, the way you see something in your peripheral vision and decide not to turn your head. He had not turned his head. He thought about the botany. He had not known she had studied botany 7 years, and he had not known that. He tried to think of what else he did not know, and found the list was more extensive than he was comfortable with. He knew she was competent. He knew the dinners ran well. He knew she was quiet and gracious, and there. He had known she was there the way you know a room has walls. He wrote her a letter. He wrote it to the solicitor's address she had given. He was not accustomed to writing letters that required something of him. His correspondence was usually of the professional variety, managed largely, he now understood, by his wife. He found that writing this kind of letter, the kind where you were trying to say something true, was much harder than he had anticipated. He said he had read what she'd written. He said he was sorry for Rosalind. He wasn't sure how to explain it, except that Rosalind had been there before everything, before the patterns had calcified, and sometimes a name surfaced from somewhere he didn't examine closely. And that was not an excuse. He understood it was not an excuse. He said he had not understood, not fully, what she had been doing. He said he thought he would like to understand if she was willing. He said he was not writing to ask her to come back. He was writing because she had deserved to be written to, and he had not done it before, and he thought it was time he started. He sealed the letter. He sat in the study for a while longer, in the quiet of a house that was not running the way it usually did, and he noticed the quiet. He had not before noticed the quiet, because before there had been no quiet. There had been a house that simply worked, that simply moved, that was warm and organized and managed. He had thought of this as the house. He understood now that it had been Thea. She was staying in rooms in Pimlico, above a bookshop, on a street that smelled like coal smoke and bread from the bakery 2 doors down. The rooms were small and drafty, and entirely hers, and she had arranged them over the first 2 days, with the same attention she had brought to Alderton Square. A particular chair by the window for reading. Her books on the shelf in the order she preferred. The watercolor of the Dorset coast hung where she could see it from the bed. She met with Mrs. Calloway on Friday. She took on the second account she had been considering, but had delayed. She began to think, carefully, about whether the work she had been doing part-time could be expanded, and how, and over what horizon of time. Her cousin, a real one, from her mother's side, a woman named Augusta who had known her since childhood, and had watched the marriage with concern and said nothing, because Thea had asked her not to, came for tea on the 3rd day. Augusta sat down, looked at her, and said, "Well," and Thea said, "Yes," and Augusta poured the tea, and that was most of what needed saying. "Are you all right?" Augusta asked, after a while. "Yes," Thea said. And then, because Augusta had always been someone she could be honest with, "Not entirely, but I'm more all right than I've been in years." Augusta looked at the watercolor on the wall. "You always liked that coast." "I bought it myself," Thea said. He never asked about it, not once. Augusta was quiet for a moment. "What will you do?" "Work," Thea said. "Save. Think. I've been doing all of it already. I just hadn't arranged it as the main thing yet." The solicitor forwarded Lawrence's letter, a week later. She read it at the table by the window, in the afternoon light, with the sounds of the street below her, and a cup of tea going cold at her elbow. She read it twice. She sat with it for a long time. The letter was not what she had expected, which was either nothing or something formal and defensive. It was neither. It was a letter from a man who was trying, imperfectly and late, to say something honest, and she could see the effort in the sentences, the way they were slightly too careful in places, the way he had started a paragraph and abandoned it and begun again. She did not know what to do with Lawrence Whitmore. She did not know yet whether there was anything there to return to, or whether returning was something she wanted. She thought it was possible that they could be, eventually, different people to each other than they had been. She thought it was equally possible that they could not. She was not ready, yet, to know. What she knew was this. She would not go back to being invisible. She would not go back to being the engine behind a life that did not acknowledge her. If there was any version of a future with Lawrence, it required him to have learned how to see her, actually see her, and she required herself to have learned how to speak. Not to manage, and to smooth and to absorb, but to say this is not acceptable, and to mean it, and to hold it. She had spent 7 years learning to make herself smaller and more useful. She was going to spend some time now learning how to take up the correct amount of space. She wrote back, not quickly. She took 4 days, because she wanted to be sure of what she meant. She wrote 1 page, clear and measured, and she said, "I received your letter. I am glad you wrote it. I am not ready to speak of what comes next, and I am not certain there is a next, but I want you to understand something. I am not waiting for rescue, and I am not making myself available to be retrieved. If you want to know who I am, who I actually am, not who you assumed was simply there, then that conversation will take a great deal of time, and a great deal of honesty, and it will happen on terms that I help to set. If that is something you are willing to undertake, write again. If not, that too is an answer." She signed it Theodora Vane. She sealed it, addressed it to the house on Alderton Square, and walked to the post herself, in the afternoon, with the smell of autumn on the street and the light going golden over the rooftops. She did not feel triumphant. She had long since stopped needing things to feel triumphant. She felt clear, and steady, and like someone who had finally agreed to take her own side in the argument she'd been losing, quietly, for years. The Dorset coast watercolor caught the last of the light when she came back to the rooms and hung on the wall above her books. and she sat in the chair by the window and opened a new ledger to the first page, and wrote, at the top, her own name, and began.